and welcome to Into the Abyss podcast. My name is Todd Decker, and once again, I am here with Jared Peterson. Jared, welcome back.
Thank you. Excited to be here.
Yeah, and I had to work hard to get you as a guest on the show because you're now a well sought after guest. You've been on other podcasts now. Is this your third podcast that you've been on?
Third ever, yes.
Third ever, yes, because you had Alex, then me, and then what was the gentleman's name who you were on with most recently?
It's David Parrott.
David Parrott.
Sample of One is the podcast.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so I listened to that and I really enjoyed it. So, encourage everyone to go check out Sample of One, and I think it was episode 4, right? With Jared Peterson. So cool, and a lot of the stuff you talked about in there we'll probably get into here as well, because it got my mind going in certain directions, and got me interested in it. And you may notice my voice is a little more raspy than usual. So I got my cough drops and my tissue paper. And we should be good to go. But fortunately, hygiene is much more of a thing now, right? So I don't even get sick as often as I used to. But I'm wearing a face mask all the time anyway, washing my hands on all surfaces. So maybe people won't catch my cold. But it doesn't seem to be COVID or anything.
We are going to eliminate all sickness.
Yeah, all sickness will be destroyed in the whole world. This is how it happens. We get a mild virus for pandemic, relatively mild, and then we all learn how to be hygienic, and then no one gets sick anymore.
Yeah, we've saved the human race. 2020.
Yes, at least that's how it would work if people could figure out how to get along. If that were one of our values. And with that segue...
Smooth.
Yes, thank you. So wanted to kind of values is like the main topic of discussion, I guess. And it seems to be, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems to be like a major intellectual interest and maybe professional interest of yours. Is that fair?
Yeah, I mean, the way I think about what kind of ties all of my interests together is I'm interested in it's like the gap between who we are and who we want to be. Mm-hmm. So there's like rationality, which cashes out as judgment and decision-making in psychology. Judgment being epistemic rationality and decision-making being instrumental rationality. And then I'm interested in motivation. And then, but part of instrumental rationality is, well, you have to know what kind of values, like what kind of values should inform your decisions.
Right.
And so it's kind of a recent interest, and the one I feel that I have the least handle over. I feel like I have a pretty good handle over motivation and judgment decision making. I mean, like not PhD level, but like I understand the fields. But value theory is this new field that I'm kind of discovering, and so it's super interesting to me because it's just so foreign, so different. I don't quite have the right mental models for how to think about it, and it makes it more exciting.
Okay. So this is a field that is out there in I guess the psychology world. I
mean, it's more philosophy. I feel like there's definitely work in it in psychology. For example, Phil Tetlock, who's big in the JDM fields for his super forecasting work and expert judgment. He did some work on like taboos, for example. But I feel like it's understudied relative to my field, which is mainly behavioral science. And so I feel like I've gotten a lot more from philosophy than I have from psychology.
Sure. Yeah. So would it be fair to say that in psychology, there's kind of the structure there for how people, once you have values in place, how you make decisions, and then how you motivate yourself to enact those decisions, but then how the values are developed in the first place is the underdeveloped part?
I feel like it's all underdeveloped. But I mean, part of that's my ignorance, right? Like I'm sure there's some great work on it, and I just don't quite know where to find it yet because I'm so new to the field. But like I don't feel like I have like I've seen really great work on how values develop. I don't feel like I've seen really great work on how values are actually used. A lot of people just kind of assume a like kind of utilitarian model where it's like all values are, you know, you can just like there's a common currency for all your values that you know cashes out as utility, and you can just like put that into a formula and output the results. And humans are just kind of this, you know, input output machine, and that just doesn't seem quite right to me. And so that's kind of why I'm interested in it, is because none of the models seem quite accurate.
Yeah, I mean, I guess so. You're saying this is a descriptive theory, right? That it's claiming that this is what people actually do is try to maximize utility in whatever language that's framed in.
Yeah, it might be similar to the beginning of behavioral economics in a way, where it was like everyone understood that the economic models were normative, but also kind of descriptive, and like they were normative, but they were descriptive enough. And so I feel like that's kind of the same situation, or continues to be the situation with utility, where it's like, yes, it's normative, but it's descriptive enough. But in the same ways, like there's some kind of weird things that aren't quite explained by it. And so those things kind of need to be explored a little bit more. At least
Yeah, right. Well, it's interesting because when I think of utilitarianism, whenever you treat it, it's kind of like you get to that point where it starts to become where you see how it doesn't jive with our normal moral intuitions, right? And that's why, and you can do two things there. One, you could say, well, okay, that's obviously not a very good normative theory, or you could say, no, that we just need to readjust our intuitions, or our moral intuitions are wrong because utilitarianism is obviously the right way to go. But I guess my whole point in bringing that up is that it almost seems obvious during the study of utilitarianism that it doesn't quite cohere with normal moral intuitions,
yeah, yeah. The way I think about it is like humans evolved to think about morality in multiple different ways, right? So like we evolved to think about the outcome, we evolved to think about the individual, and we evolved to think about the behavior, right? And like all like so any moral dimension, any value dimension, we value it across all three of those dimensions. So, you know, like utilitarianism is only focused on the outcome, and virtue ethics is only focused on the individual, and deontology is only focused on the behavior. But that's too simplified. Like humans use all three. Like we judge anything on all three dimensions.
Yeah, yeah, that's a very good point. You're almost looking at only one axis in that space, and you're not going to get a full picture. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
an interesting point. You made you talked a little bit on the other podcast about how there's almost like well, at different times of your life you have different values, right? And you can't really transfer or translate the reasoning from one stage to another, right? Like you gave the example of having kids at one, not wanting to have kids at one stage, but then finding that satisfying at another, and that there's not really a good way to, or is there a good way? I mean, it doesn't seem like there's utilitarianism doesn't seem sufficient to be able to explain that, but is there a good model for that?
A good model for how values change over the lifetime?
Yeah.
I don't know. You know, so I recently read Agnes Callard's book called Aspiration, which is where a lot of my thoughts around this are coming from. I really like Agnes Callard. She's, you know, one of my everything I've ever read from her or anything I've ever watched her in, I've always enjoyed. I really like how she thinks about things. And so for her, aspiration is this idea that, like, I'll give the example that I gave in the other podcast, which is that of having children, right? Is like if like I don't really enjoy kids. Like if you get like if I had a baby right now, I wouldn't enjoy being with a baby. It's kind of smelly, it's kind of loud. Like why would I enjoy that? But at the same time, like so if I reason from who I am now and say, like, is it rational? If I did like a utilitarian calculation and said, should I have a kid? My values cash out right now is saying no, like, don't have a child. But I know that if I have a kid, then my values are going to change. And so once I'm a father, I will then enjoy those things that I now currently do not enjoy. So if I reason from who I will be, then it is rational to make the decision. But how do you make that decision? Like, why should I reason from who I will be and not from who I am? And there's a famous thought experiment is actually around vampires, right? So if you have a choice to become a vampire, and you're going to enjoy sucking blood, and you're going to enjoy wearing all black and very classy clothes, checking out, young women in Seattle area, according to Twilight. And like, that does not sound enjoyable to me in my current state. But if I were a vampire, it'd be very enjoyable. So like, is it rational to become a vampire? And the same token, is it rational to be a father? And just like, I don't know how to answer that.
Yeah.
So as far as like how to model it, like I kind of think that like throughout our lifetimes, we're slowly creating a more coherent value system, that our values when we're children are just very incoherent. And then as we get older, we're reasoning through and trying to create a coherent value system. And I think that's kind of part of what's happening. And that's why it's rational to become a father, but not rational to become a vampire. It's because I'm working towards a coherent model. And right now there's some incoherence. But it's like I value fatherhood, but I don't value being a father. And I'm trying to work out that coherence. And so it's rational to aspire to be a father. But it's not incoherent in any way for me to not desire to be a vampire.
Right. Yeah, it seems like a kind of a second order value, right? It's like, what should I value, even though I don't value it now? A couple of things that come to mind. One is if your society has certain values that they encourage. So like if fatherhood or something like that is encouraged, even if it's not appealing before that time, I have this external source that I use to decide what my values should be. And then another thing that comes to mind is just kind of a random element. You reach certain points where you could go either way, and maybe weighted in one direction or the other. But I guess a model would have to incorporate some of that randomness. So I'm thinking of comparisons to physical models, but so like in certain cases, some models have stochastic elements where we just don't have enough information, right? So we have to incorporate some type of randomness, epistemic randomness, like just because we don't know. Or in other cases, it could be that maybe it goes all the way down, where there really is some type of radical break where we just make a decision. You reach that point. It's like, okay, am I gonna pursue the family life, gonna get married and have kids, or am I going to go this other direction as the single bachelor and focus on career life or something like that? And there's really no way to know which way it's going to go.
Yeah. Well, and what that brings up is this idea, like no model is what's the phrase? No model is true, but some are useful, right?
Yeah.
I was reading something recently. It was talking about how the surprising thing about the Newtonian model isn't that it stops working at the very large and at the very small. The surprising thing about the Newtonian model is that it works for such a wide range of things, right?
Yeah.
Because most models break down much before that. If build any kind of linear model, like nothing is really linear in nature. It always breaks down. It always flattens out or reverses. Like no model applies across all
scales.
Yes, and none do. And so when you have something like that with morality, like it's kind of scary. It's like, well, my morality doesn't apply at all scales. in which case you have to do something which kind of relates to what I was saying earlier is, you have more than one moral model. Like maybe you have a little bit of deontology, a little bit of virtue ethics, and a little bit of utilitarianism. And you just have enough like moral humility to say, well, I'm going to use a little bit all three. I'm going to try and triangulate and try to make it work across all three models. And sometimes that doesn't always work. But if you can get it to work in all three models, well, you can feel pretty solid. It's the fox versus the hedgehog, right? It's like the hedgehog only knows one thing. And if you prioritize and only use this one model, you're going to screw up. But if you take the fox approach and use multiple models, you generally come out with better results.
Yeah, that seems very practical. One of the things I wonder about is how you can use that type of knowledge to influence people or persuade people. Because especially with values, it's really important to the way we interact as a society and live together. And one of the things that concerns me is that there are incompatible values that cause a lot of conflict, and hopefully not to the point that would be completely destabilizing to society. But that's a worry that I have. But then, so what can we do to influence people's values with thinking in this way about how people value things?
Yeah. So I have a lot of thoughts around that. But the first question I want to ask is, are you sure you want to? In particular, I'm thinking about personality. And there's some research that suggests that the reason that personality exists, that we're not all the same, is because it's useful to have that variation. It's useful to have people that are high on conscientiousness and low on conscientiousness, high on extroversion and low on extroversion. Like it's useful and evolutionary advantageous for a society to have that variation. And one way of thinking about personalities is it's a difference in values, right? Like extroverts, they value extroversion is complicated. It's actually not just social. It seems to be that they value all kinds of rewards more. I can't remember if that's a liking or a wanting distinction there, but they seem to value rewards more. And so one way to say that is that personality differs, so therefore values differ. And the reason values differ is because it's useful for society to have all this kind of variety, right? You kind of want a little bit of variety in a world that's so chaotic, because the world right now, like America, is mostly pretty stable. It's 2020, so not the most stable it's ever been, but it's pretty stable. And so maybe right now, like the more liberal, almost socialist values are better because we are so stable and we are so wealthy, and so it's more about equality, and those are the values we want. But that doesn't mean we want to persuade those people who are constantly chiding us to, no, we got to grow the economic pie because disaster might happen, and we want to like lower the debt because disaster might happen. Because if society is less stable, well, then we might want the strong military. And so just because certain values are useful right now in this particular point in history doesn't mean that the other values won't be valuable at a different point in history. And so the question is, how much persuasion do we actually want to engage in?
You sound a little bit like me, being the moral pluralist. I'm not sure what to think about that, but
I've had an awakening.
Yeah, I mean that's a very interesting point, and I wasn't thinking along those lines, but yeah, I think that is important. And I guess one thing that complicates that is that, like, say we make that a higher order value of having the value pluralism, but then when that other people don't value, they want uniformity, and maybe that's a part of the soup as well that makes it important. That it's definitely something I value. Like my a lot of people have their allegiances on like their Facebook profiles and things like that. Whether you're Team Trump or Team Biden and all that. And mine is me with my dad in both, right? And at least getting along. And that's kind of what I see as like an important value for me, right? That even with our different values, that my higher value is that we can get along, and that we stay unified even amid our disagreements. So I'm totally I like what you're saying there.
Yeah, and one way of thinking about it is like, we have the liberal like bedrock upon what we're building, and everyone's free to pursue happiness however they see fit, so long as they're building on top of that bedrock. But if you're itching away, if you're digging away at that bedrock and trying to destabilize it, well, then you're out, right? Like we can at least agree that there's some values that if we're to coexist, like those are the ones that we have to keep. And so that's not to say that, as I'm talking about value pluralism, that doesn't mean that no persuasion is ever necessary. Like, I think racism, for example, is just outright wrong. There's nothing really good to say about it, and so there should be persuasion there.
Yeah, and that's a good point. I like that. So we could say like, okay, broadly, would we want uniformity or would we want persuasion? Okay, maybe not. Maybe we do want that pluralism, but there are those extreme cases, right? So let's talk about those. So where there are just these really antisocial, destructive values that people have. So how do those people change?
Yeah. So, there's kind of a question. When someone has different values than you, there's often a question like, do they actually have different values than you, or do they have different facts than you? So, for example, if someone values military strength, and like you're like, yeah, like I value the military, but like it's 2020, there's no World War III happening. Well, it's not that they have different values than you. It might just be that they perceive a threat that you don't, right? And so that could be a different in beliefs rather than a different in values. So one way of persuasion is just like figuring out, do we actually believe the same things? In other cases, there might be similar facts, like maybe you and I believe completely the same things about immigration and about diversity, but maybe I just like value that slightly more than you. And so there's like a difference in weights. Like so we still both value the same thing, but there's a difference in how much we weigh it. And I think in that case, which I think is often the case, like because this is how I kind of think about humans is like mostly we share the same values. Like everyone kind of values security, everyone kind of values liberty and health, and whatever other values that there are. Like like no one's gonna be like, oh, I don't value freedom at all. Like everyone values freedom to some extent, but those values can kind of get like pushed down in a way. And so what you need to do is kind of bring that value to the surface. One way of modeling humans, and this is a model, not a theory, because I don't know what the proper theory is that humans consist of multiple agents. It's kind of a Jungian psychodynamics theory, right? Like, you have an area, you can imagine it as an area in your brain that like this area of your brain, like it values security, and this other area values liberty, and you have all of these different little agents in your brain that all value different things. And one thing you do is like so everyone's a communist and everyone's a libertarian because all of the agents are there. It's just a question of like framing it and getting the right agent to come to action. Because so you have situations where, for example, libertarians who are very not anti-police, but very wary about a police state will suddenly come out very strongly for the police during the riots. And it's like, whoa, did you just pull a 180? And it's like, well, maybe, but maybe like that agent, again, this is a model, not a theory. Maybe that agent that values security was just like kind of asleep because it didn't see any threat. And now that the threat's there and it's been framed for that agent, now the agent's like, oh, threats everywhere, threats are salient, and now security is a major value. So I think part of persuasion is actually not so much persuasion, so much as just like getting someone's values to just emerge. Like they're already there. You just have to get them to emerge.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a very interesting point. And I was thinking, I was reading a little bit on the systems theory article that you'd shared with us before, and it was talking about context, um, and that seems kind of relevant to that. That with agents would respond differently to our internal agents would respond differently in different contexts to certain situations. Yeah, I'm fascinated by that. Because I had asked you before, like, okay, what's your I think I had asked theory, but let's say, what's your model of values? And you'd referred to that. Now, and it sounds similar to like some of the classical thought, like in Plato. But do you see some affinity there to like Plato's, the charioteer and all the different horses trying to work in different directions?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, psychology always struggles with this question of like it always feels easiest to model the brain as multiple agents, as charioteers fighting each other, or id, ego, super ego. um, you know some people say that the Greeks didn't think the gods were actual gods, but that you have this like passion agent in your brain that kind of drives you. And so isn't that the god of love because it drives you? um,
Right.
Even Kahneman has system one and system two, which he describes as homunculi, this kind of derogative term that no scientist should ever use a homunculi to describe a behavior. But he does that because it facilitates and makes it easy to think about these things. um, and so, yeah, I mean, it really does feel like you have multiple agents. And there's even this idea of aleafs, right? You have beliefs and aleafs.
Yeah.
So if you are walking on what is it, the glass in the Grand Canyon, the glass balcony that's out over the Grand Canyon, like you can believe with all your might that you can walk over that and you'll be completely safe, and like the engineers will tell you that elephants can walk on it and cars could drive on it and it wouldn't be a problem. But you go walk over that balcony and try and jump up and down and it scares you and you're like, I just can't do this. It's too much. And it's like cognitively you know that it's safe, but it still feels like there's a part of you that just can't quite believe that this glass is safe. And so, yeah, it constantly feels like the best way to model the brain is through multiple agents.
Yeah. Yeah. And is that part of the model versus theory distinction that you're making?
The model versus theory distinction is more about um, what's useful versus what is true. A theory is like an actual theory for like what is the actual mechanism that's actually working here that describes how things are. A model is just like, this is a useful way to think about it. It's probably wrong, but it at least gets us close enough to the right answer that we can act on it.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, I mean, in this case, I can see the multiple agents idea being very useful, even if we're not positing that, okay, our mind actually has these independent agents, like in the Inside Out movie, working inside us. Yeah.
Exactly.
And I see, I see your point there that there's this kind of hesitation in psychology because there's the temptation to come up with these systems like with the charioteer and the id, ego, and super ego. It's like, oh, I hope people don't really take this literally. Oh, and maybe some people did mean it literally, but we always want to make sure that people don't think we're crazy. So something I was thinking about so say like going back to the cases where okay, these are the psychopaths or people who are murderous or dangerous or where there are values and behaviors that we need to reform in some way. I was wondering of the role of the arts to bring those kind of things out, like kind of internally, like what would be more effective, right? To rationalize through it and walk people through step by step and show like, okay, this is why your values are not good, versus creating some type of experience that reforms them from the inside, I guess. But do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, so we talked a little bit about this in the aesthetics episode. Um, I had an experience on 4th of July that was like this very moving, patriotic experience. There was an element of diversity in it as well. Like, this is America. This is what we are meant to be. And I felt like that kind of changed my values in some way, that this kind of emotional experience. But it was also propaganda,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like, this experience was like, it was like the Air Force band that was playing, and 4th of July fireworks paid by the city, I'm sure. And it was this very, and so it's like, I think looking, maybe it's a case where, like, looking back, to me, it felt like a rational move, to change the values in the way that I did, to value diversity more than I did, to value patriotism more than I did prior to that experience. But I also think I probably would have valued those things prior. Like, I would have had a second order desire to have those values
Mm,
prior to that experience. I would have wanted to value diversity more than I did. I would have wanted to want patriotism more than I did before.
yeah.
Not be completely true, but I think that would be the case. And so, sorry, I'm kind of meandering around your actual question, which I think was more about what's right and what's like the normative way to do it. And like, I don't know, like, propaganda is kind of scary. It kind of feels like maybe that shouldn't be the way we do it. But
Well, actually, no. I'm more thinking just like how effective is it? Yeah, because well, part of the I think you had mentioned something in your interview about how like values don't exist, but we have them, or something like that. Do you remember? Or maybe you could just phrase it, your position on that. But that. But when we have values, how are we going to work with them? It's kind of skipping the meta-ethical question, I guess, and just focusing on the ethics.
yeah, I mean, I think I was just explaining the is not gap. I don't know the exact language I use, but like, I don't think values are out there in the universe. There's no, like, there's a coherence theory of value, but there's no correspondence theory of value. Like, there's no
Yeah.
correspondence between what we value and what is actually in the universe.
Yeah, and so I'm kind of thinking, if we think of like the cosmogony of you have Jesus and Satan before the foundation of the universe, and they have their teams, right? And you have to decide which team you're going to be on, and maybe is accepting the it's God, right? So it's God or Satan. So there's really no other than saying that, well, God's always right, so I'm going to go with him. But if you really do want to decide, it is a radical choice, and it almost seems like there's like a conversion when there's a real major twist, like. And maybe it's several levels up, like, it's not only changing your primary or secondary values, but your third order values or something like that. I have this, I guess I have this desire to think that at some level there is some type of way to model it in a rational way. But a lot of the things that seem irrational to us, or from our perspective are irrational and make no sense, at some higher level have some explanation, but in the philosophy of science we talk about rational reconstructions. So like scientists will have their things that they do, and a lot of in the history of science, a lot of it wasn't really for what we would look at as the most rational of reasons, but at least at face value. But you can go back and look at the process and see, okay, well, this is why it worked out, and why it arrived at these results. And I wonder if there's something like that too. If you go up, if you get broad enough in your model of the way we have values, that there would be some explanation, even if a lot of it seems irrational or just out of the blue.
Yeah, I do think values are constrained at the very least, right?
Now, do you mean like for an individual or just like in general? Like,
I would say for all of humanity. For I know I'll even be broader than that. For all rational beings, insofar as rational beings is sentient beings is maybe a better way of putting it. Because I think there's only so many different ways that sentient beings could evolve and exist, and just human nature and sentient being nature, like it's constrained in many ways. And oh, you know, like I don't think math is arbitrary. For example, like I don't think it's arbitrary to say 2 + 2 = 4. I think there's in some way that's true with like a capital T.
Oh, you're wading into some serious Twitter war material there.
Which, by the way, in that particular debate, I took the other side because he was talking about notation.
Oh, okay.
At least I believe he was talking about notation. Other people was talking about the capital T true.
People are silly.
Yeah. So, and because math is not arbitrary, I think game theory, for example, is not arbitrary. And game theory is not the only way to model how people and beings interact, but it's a useful way. And so, but there's only so many ways that game theory works. There's only so many Nash equilibriums when certain situations, like there's only so many ways. And so when you have a constrained environment like that, like the values that develop are going to be kind of universal. So it may not be that in the same way that like evolution didn't exist at the Big Bang, but the principles that would lead to evolution existed then. And I think something kind of similar exists with values, where it's like, yes, values didn't exist at the Big Bang, but the values that we now have were always kind of inevitable, because there's only so many ways for sentient beings to exist, and only so many ways for sentient beings to interact, and only so many ways for coexistence to be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's an encouraging thought in a way that that things wouldn't be so radically different that there'd be no ability to communicate.
Yeah, if God rolled the die again, I think we get pretty similar values.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. See, I want to come back to. So on the hierarchy of values, you mentioned like that we all seem to have like a common set of values, common suite of values, but different weights and priorities that we give to them. And at first, I was coming into this thinking that putting putting one value over the others could be a problem. So the unity thing, right? I'm like, oh, okay, a unity should be a pretty high value. But now you got me thinking along these lines of this plurality of having a society with lots of different people. So like freedom, for example, some people would put freedom as the number one, and I've done that in my life as well, where freedom is very important. It's definitely something we value. But I can see possible destructive places that could lead. But now, I'm wondering if having a certain number of people, you need a certain number of people who have freedom as like their primary value for a society to function properly.
Yeah, I kind of, the way I think about it is almost like like we didn't need a pandemic response team in 2019. And so, or 2018, 17, 16, and whenever it was that Trump fired the pandemic response team, right? It was like, yeah, it was like we didn't need them, so why pay for them, right? But 2020, we clearly did need them. And it's kind of the optimizer's curse, right? In that if you're optimizing on this one single dimension, that you kind of lose all of the feedback systems and backups that you should have.
Yeah.
So I think some values kind of serve like that. They're kind of like these backup systems when everything else goes wrong. But other values are much more like foundational and bedrock. That no matter what the situation is, you would always want to have them.
Yeah. What about? Well, and I've been thinking about vices as well. So like, I've recently finished The Good Place. So there's this part where, Chidi is trying to design this afterlife, and so he asks the Janets to bring him a copy of Judith Sklar's Ordinary Vices. But it looks at it from the side also of what do we want to avoid? What are the anti-values? All right. So it seems like racism is a big one, obviously, right? I mean, that's one that gets a lot of attention. We definitely don't like racism, and it's almost like maybe it's like the flip side of a value, but we do a lot to in society to push back against it and make sure that we raise people not to be racist. And Judith Sklar, her example was cruelty, and what's the other big one? I guess probably like homophobia would be not as universal, but it's a big one. It's probably going to continue to become an important vice that we focus on. But have you thought about that as far as like in your theory or your models of values of the things that we like want to anti-value?
I'll say not as much. I've often more focused on what I'll call like positive psychology. is always drawn me more than abnormal psychology. I'm more interested in getting humans from like average to great rather than getting from bad to at least normal. I've always been interested on that side of the equation, I'll say. And so I haven't spent a long time thinking about vices, but you've been thinking about it, and so I've been trying to think about it. It's interesting in that it's similar to negative utilitarianism. That usually utilitarianism is only focused on the positive values, but I have a few friends that are negative utilitarians, and they're only focused on the negative utility. They're only focused on suffering. It's not about improving life, be it like not getting life from 0 to 100. It's about getting life from negative 50 to 0. And if you're at 1, I don't care. If you're at 5 or 10 or 15, I don't care. As long as you're not below 0, that's all I care about.
Mm-hmm.
And those friends kind of scare me, honestly.
It sounds crazy.
Yeah. Often because a lot of negative utilitarians kind of feel that life shouldn't exist.
Right.
Because if positive utility doesn't matter, then only negative utility matters. And the only way to get rid of negative utility is really, for life to not exist. And so it's interesting, this idea that it's vices that we should focus on. And I'm kind of curious how you take it, but like I'm not sure because I haven't spent a lot of time thinking about it.
Yeah, it seems like it's an interesting intellectual tool. It's kind of like I was telling my wife yesterday that there are little when you get a new tool, you kind of want to try it out and use it on a lot of different things. So when it occurred to me, I was thinking, that's an interesting way of looking at things. I don't anticipate that it'll be like my main tool that I use, but it's kind of interesting to see what it does.
You
But it seems. Oh, go ahead.
you got to be a fox, not a hedgehog. Got to use all of these different models.
Exactly. Right. Yeah. It's. It seems like it has some type of role to play. Well, here's an example that I've thought of it like in my personal life. So like, uh, especially like in relationships, how I interact with people. Thinking back in like earlier in my career, how I interacted with coworkers, or back in my mission when I had a lot of interactions in close quarters. I've had a lot of reflection where I've thought, that was not my best moment there. But I feel like I'm improving. That I'm doing better, and so I do think about the negative instances in certain ways, but with a positive effect of like, okay, but I'm making improvements. So it's the repentance seems to be an applicable way of looking at it. That I mean, there's you could almost say there's like negative repentance and positive repentance, right? Like super erogatory repentance, where you're just trying to not even do things that aren't bad, but just do more good. But not doing the bad, and reforming the vices is important too.
I mean, it kind of gets back to the etymology of virtue, which I believe means excellence, right? Which is a conversation we've had before. Which it's kind of a question of like, where's the moral zero point, right? Like, I think it's better for, like, if a woman gets sexually assaulted, I think it's virtuous for her to call it out, to report it, to warn other women. Like, I consider that virtuous. But if she doesn't, did she drop below a moral zero point and now she's a bad person? And I don't think that's the case, because virtue isn't just about, it isn't just 100 to negative 100. It's also 0 to 100, right? Mm-hmm. And like, it's kind of going above and beyond the minimum standard. And I've often thought about virtues in terms of that it's not about overcoming the bad, but just about maximizing the good. Mm-hmm. And it might just depend on your personality in some ways. I have a friend that is fairly OCD, comes from a very religious background, and struggles quite a bit, with what I always saw as kind of like arbitrary rules in church, but his family treats as these like absolute commandments that you must do. And if he didn't do it exactly as he was supposed to do, he would beat himself up. And like, one of the things like I've tried to help him see over the years, since I've known him, is just like not everything is about, not everything sets you to below the moral zero point. Sometimes you're just at the moral zero point and you're just trying to do better. It's not that you're sinking below some minimum standard. It's just that you're there, like you're fine, you're coasting along, and you're trying to be the best that you can. It's not that you're trying to make up. Like, let Christ handle the screw ups. Like, you're just focusing on getting from 0 to 10, and Christ is what's handling negative 10 to 0.
Yeah. Cool. Well, I've like one more question for you. And I know that you are very interested in your, like you have your own mission statements, and kind of tracking your own goals and self-improvement. And that's, but so how do you, where do you think those values come from? When you're selecting what your mission is going to be, or how do you choose your values? I guess both like consciously, or also like even beyond your own conscious realization. Like, where do you think those are coming from?
I don't know. That's the easy answer. Um, I mean, there's so many contributing factors to the values that you have that it's hard just to like point to one single process and be like, this is where my values came from. Like some of your values come from evolution, some come from personality, some come from like particular quirks of your brain that have nothing like just random uh, random mutations. A lot comes from culture. Like I would say, probably a majority comes from culture um, and religion, and like you don't belong to just one culture; you belong to many cultures, and sometimes like one value system um, will mean something like you'll just be at a particular point in your life and this new value system will come along and it will answer all of your questions for that particular moment in your life and like you just kind of run with it, but then that doesn't mean that the other value systems aren't also relevant. It was just at that particular point in your life that was the one that was relevant. And so I mean these are kind of all these bottom up processes where your values, it almost feels like your values are choosing you because like you don't really have all of that much influence over them. They just kind of bubble up from nowhere and they choose you. But then you can also have this like, and this goes back to what you're talking about earlier of like the aesthetic way of persuasion versus like the reasoning way of persuasion. Whereas like aesthetic, like when you have like an aesthetic experience that like I did on that 4th of July, like that's kind of this bottom up process. I don't feel like I really had a lot of control. It just kind of happened to me. But sometimes you can kind of reason your way and you're trying to make a coherent framework. Like you have all these different moral frameworks and you're trying to make them coherent and bring them all into one. And like that's that kind of top down approach. Uh, and so, like, where did my particular values come from? Like, I think it's partly because like I was a depressed teenager with not a lot of friends and I had motivational issues because I was depressed. And I felt like if I could just do the things that I know that I should do, my life would be perfect. Like it's like I know I need friends and I know if I went and talked to people, like I could make friends. Like I'm not so weird that I can't do that. But like I just couldn't bring myself to do it. And so for me it was always about like how do I just get myself to do the things that I know that I should do? And at some point I realized, well, maybe I don't actually know what I should do, which led me down to studying rationality. And then maybe I didn't even know what values I should have, which led me to studying values. But like, it's just my peculiar life situation that gave rise to my values. And I end up writing this mission statement of, and it's basically been unchanged for the last decade, but which could be summarized as like getting people from how they are to how they ought to be, or how they think they ought to be. And also helping them figure out like what values do they think they ought to have and how to reason to get there. And then once they reason and make a decision, like how do they actually ensure that they do it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was actually one of my. You answered my follow-up question, but is if your mission statement changes? Because did you say you rewrite it every year? I remember you saying something like that.
Yeah, I mean, I just occasionally. I mean, at least once a year, I really sit down and think about it.
Yeah.
First, unintentionally, that it wasn't something I was doing on purpose. It was just happened to be that, I guess with the fresh start of the new year, that I would want to sit down and think, okay, like what am I doing this next year, and trying to like figure out, you know, like how like what I was studying in school, how that played into this higher mission statement and the things I was interested in and how I was treating my friends, like how does that all play into this mission statement? And so I just kind of happened to like, every year it's like, well, I learned some new things and I change it slightly, or I just decided I didn't like the language. And so, I mean, I have like 20 different versions of the mission statement that I've written in the last 10 years, because I don't just write it every year, but I kind of rewrite it throughout the year. Um, but it's always been the same. It's always been like something about truth, something about motivation, something about like overcoming hurdles, and like something about sort of self-actualization or self-transcendence or becoming more than you are. It's some kind of language around that.
Yeah.
And sometimes I use religious language. Sometimes it's more scientific language. One time I tried mythological language, decided that was too corny, and went back to the science language. I mean, I change it, but it's always been basically the same.
Yeah, it sounds. It just seems like all the stuff you've been talking about seems very pragmatic and reasonable. And well, now I want to know, like, are you besides like talking with people on podcasts and stuff about it, do you have plans to like publish your thoughts around these type of things?
I've it's funny you mentioned that. Just recently, I was like, if I did write something about the gap between who we are and who we ought to be, gap between who we are and who we want to be, I should say. Like, what would I write? And I started writing down some thoughts. Like, there's stuff around, like, how do we find truth once we know the truth? Like, what kind of values do we have? Should we have? And then how do we combine the truth and the values to make decisions? And then once we make a decision, how do we actually do it? And kind of making like a 4-part book or article around those ideas. But the problem is I have so much to say about all 4 topics, and I felt kind of all over the place. So I don't know if I'll ever actually write it, but I started to write something. We'll see if it actually turns into something.
Cool. Well, very good. Well, thank you very much for talking with me tonight and coming on. And I'm glad that we were planning to do it a couple nights ago, but I'm glad that I got to listen to your interview beforehand. It gave me some interesting things to think about that I'd want to talk with you on. So it's always a pleasure.
Yeah, thanks, Todd. It was a lot of fun.
All right. I'll see you later.